Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good afternoon. This is Stephen Hernandez. Welcome back if you have returned from our previous two sessions. This is session three. For today, we're going to be talking about modern in quotes, maybe question mark, modern communication issues and communications for couples and families. So this is the third part of our series in communications on the holy month of Ramadan. Thank you so much for being here. Inshallah, your fasts are going well. Your du'as are being accepted. Let's get into our session. So again, for those of you who are new, my name is Stephen Hernandez. I am a marriage and relationship educator by training. That's not what I do full-time anymore, but it's something I continue to do as often as I can. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do this for the community. I have a YouTube channel, which is called Stephen Hernandez's Nonprofit Fundamentals, where I focus on my relationship work and what I do my day job, which is focused around philanthropy in the nonprofit world. I also have a podcast, which is called Stephen Hernandez's Nonprofit Relationship Fundamentals, which is, again, kind of addresses both of those big issues in my life. And inshallah, I hope you have an opportunity to check both of those out. Our topic today, our objective today will be to understand new or old issues facing families and couples today. And something I really want to stress right from the top is, having done marriage and relationship work for more than a decade now, every couple, every community, every race and religion truly believes that their issues are unique to them. Now, I'm here to tell you they're not. So I want you to feel good about that as we go through these various issues, and they're going to be different. The issues are always the same. I want to start with that. The issues are always the same. The order of importance that each couple, community, race, or religion puts them in is slightly different, but the issues are always the same. Now, that should make you feel better in the sense that any issues that you're working through are things that humans have always been grappling with. And we're going to talk about that today. That's why I put that question mark under modern, because some of these things are modern in some ways, but they may not be as modern as we think they are. So to recap, we always have to kind of start with the fundamental lesson we address in week one. And if you haven't seen that, inshallah, go to the YouTube channel, check it out week one. Again, please provide any comments or feedback to the organizers. I'm sure they would love to hear that. So recap, where do our communication styles come from? They come from our culture, the art that we produce or consume, the people that we come from, the countries that we come from, the religion that we come from. All those set the template for our life, and they establish, as I've said before, the guidelines around what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior, what is to be lauded and rewarded, what is to be punished and shunned. That all comes from our culture, which is made up of our personal history, our family history, our culture's history, the history of our people, the history of our religion. All that feeds into who we are and what we do. So if you ask anyone, especially in the Islamic community and a lot of communities, I hear this all the time. As before COVID, I would travel around the country and I would do a lot of singles workshops. And I would primarily do them for young professionals who are first or second generation. And there was always this undercurrent of, these elders don't understand like what we young people want. And the elders in the room would be like, these young kids, they don't understand like there's traditions that's important, and they're getting into haram things, and we're really worried about the future. Understandable, appreciated, and appropriate. But spoiler alert, throughout human history, the older generation has always felt that. The younger generation has always felt that. We have always had this push-pull of, the kids these days, they don't want to work very hard. And, the adults, they just don't understand the issues that we're going through. A number of years ago, I read an article, and I found fascinating that for those of you who know a little bit of your Roman history, there was a famous city that was just completely destroyed by the eruption of the volcano of Vesuvius, like completely buried the city of Pompeii. So it was essentially like entombed in magma and ash, and it solidified into rock. Even now, they're uncovering things from that time because the city was just completely buried. And so there have been some records, a lot of records that they found, and like, just like personal correspondence between people who lived at the time. So it's a great snapshot of like 2000 plus years ago, or however long, more than 1,000 years ago now, for sure. I think closer to two, what people were concerned about, what they were thinking about. And so they found letters. It was I think pretty well off, like businessman. He was writing to one of his coworkers or like a friend of his. And again, this is like more than 1,000 years ago. And what was he writing about? He was writing about his concerns for his children, for his son, I think in particular. And he was like writing to Octavius or something like that. And essentially, what his letter was like, Octavius, these darn kids, they have no respect for the tradition, that we grew up on. They don't work hard. They want to, kind of get into all these crazy fashions. And, they just, they don't understand what it is to be a proper person. And I'm really worried about the future. That was like 2,000 years ago. People have always felt this way because there's always that push-pull between tradition, the things that kind of create our culture, that gird, what is appropriate, inappropriate behavior, and the ever present dynamic of change. We are fooling ourselves if we think that there is no change around us or in us or things that we experience all the time. That does not mean we should just accept everything that comes to us. That should not mean we should blindly follow everything that comes before us. I'm not here to make judgment calls on people's traditions, but I am just stressing to you all that the feelings that we feel as young people or as parents, that's something that every parent has felt, every young person has felt, and every young person who becomes a parent will feel those feelings themselves one day. So let's get into this a little bit more. Where are these pressures coming from? One of the things that we're experiencing is that our cultures are not as monolithic as they used to be. It's always interesting to me is as a convert to Islam, that people who have grown up with it, they don't understand, or they maybe have forgotten that the early Islam, was just such an amalgamation of different people from different tribes, different cultures, and different ethnicities, and so that idea that there is that your particular cultural norms and traditions are the one and only way really kind of flies in the face of what the Sahaba and the Rasul, praise be upon them, they really kind of experienced as not a monolithic culture. And so as the world is becoming more globalized again, as it was perhaps in that time where people are freely meeting and connecting with one another, we're bumping into a lot of different cultures. And that puts a pressure on us in terms of who we are and where we're coming from. There is ever increasing pressure on us as individuals because there are societal pressures that we're experiencing in the society that we're living from, such as the pressure of modern life. Something that my father told me, that my grandfather told me when I visited him, as a young man. As I think I mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, my grandfather grew up on a farm in Mexico, and he, a very small village in the mountains of Mexico. And he had come to the United States as a young man, but he said he didn't like it. So he came back. And I asked him, why did you not like the United States? And he thought about it for a little bit. And he said, people in America are always moving around and they're always busy, but they get nothing done. Which is a very powerful indictment, which is why I chose this image right here. In my grandfather's mind, he found modern life to be too busy and empty and incomplete. And you can agree with that or not, but the facts are, in a lot of ways, people are working more, we're more productive, but we're spending less time together, like really spending time together. We have more money to spend on our hobbies, but we have less time to do our hobbies. We can afford more and better things for our kids, but we struggle to connect with them. We want like a traditional a life that maybe our parents or our grandparents had, but in order to achieve a lifestyle that we feel that we have to have, In the United States, for example, we often need to have two or even more income earners in order to have a standard of living that we feel that we must uphold. The pressure of modern life really is causing a lot of issues in terms of communication and all kinds of issues for couples that I see all the time that's ever increasing. These pressures also include generational conflicts. Think of the global changes that you have experienced. Perhaps if you're first generation like myself, my parents, especially my father, he grew up in a small village in the 60s and 70s. He had no running water. He had no electricity in the home that he grew up with. His home was carved out of rock from the mountain and had a thatched roof when he was a young man. He didn't see a TV up until he was an adult. Now my dad, has an iPhone and he can record videos and watch YouTube. In my father's own life, he went from having no power, no electricity to having the world at his fingertips. That's a huge global change. Him and most of his brothers moved to the United States. Think of your parents or your grandparents. Maybe they got into a steamship. Maybe they got into a plane and they maybe had never come back to the places where they're from. Think of the change internally that would have caused from them. Global immigration issues. I'm Mexican. My wife is Yemeni. We were both first-generation college students that met at college. Perhaps like many of you who are listening right now are in college. You're around different people. I learned about Islam because I met Muslims in college. If I had only gone to high school, I probably wouldn't have met Muslims. I probably wouldn't have, learned about the Quran, and become a convert myself. That's happened because of increasing immigration. I live in the Dearborn area, so I met a bunch of people that I might not otherwise have done so. But these generational conflicts also come too from a generational level, because I think of my parents' time, and this is something I think about a lot for my own children. My parents were from a generation which was, you learn English. You speak English in the home so the kids don't have an accent, so they don't feel awkward as not being American enough. And I never learned really how to read and write Spanish. Now, many of you maybe are first or second generation, or perhaps went to Arabic school, whether you wanted to or not, or learn Arabic through the Quran, or maybe you learn Urdu or what have you from your parents. But that idea, again, is very generational that I've experienced, where in my culture, their push was in previous generations, well, you need to learn English and to become more Americanized. And one of the conflicts that we see even in the political realm now is that new immigrants are not assimilating quickly enough. Like they're not embracing the American melting pot, which, as you may recall, for those of you who are older, when I was in school, that was presented as a very wonderful thing. But when you think about it, the American melting pot really, if you get down to it, was cultures coming from Europe, the Middle East, Africa, what have you, abandoning their cultural practices, abandoning perhaps their religions or their languages, certainly, to embrace what was a ill-defined American heritage. And so what I see in terms of a lot of generational conflicts is that you have the younger generation really wanting to hold on to the traditions, the language, the culture of their family of origin, and that sometimes causes generational conflict. So in the marriage work that I do, what I found interesting is that a number of people told me that maybe their parents or grandparents, maybe they weren't particularly conservative or practicing in terms of their Islam or whatnot, and that was never like an issue in their home. Like it was just not something that they grew up with. But like say they meet a convert, or they meet someone from a different race or ethnic group, and they want to marry them, then all of a sudden their Syrian father is really into being Syrian, and it's very important that you marry Syrians. And a Imam told me something that I found very fascinating with regards to these generational issues, which was that this Imam said, and he was an immigrant himself, is that you have to understand, because I was brought to him this issue that so many young people, so many young Muslims did not want to marry inside their culture. I've heard many young women, primarily, but young men say, like, I'm never going to marry a Syrian. Like, I'll never marry a Lebanese man. I'm never going to marry a Southeast Asian woman, et cetera, et cetera. So I spoke to this imam. And I asked, well, why do you think this is? Like, what's going on here? Or the parents really being against cross-cultural marriages? And the imam said, you have to understand from their perspective, they came here, they left everything that they knew, they felt the pressure to learn the language, to become American. But you can't leave so much of yourself behind and not feel that loss. Maybe you can deal with it for yourself. But as you think of the prospect of your children or your grandchildren, forgetting the language, forgetting, God forbid, the deen, forgetting the culture that they come from, that really frightens them. It really causes them anxiety. And so I think at the core of these generational conflicts, especially with regards to cross-cultural relationships, I think that fear, I agree with that imam, is the concern of the parents or the grandparents is, well, I've already sacrificed so much of the culture that I don't want to see our family lose even more. You know, I definitely think we can get into that further, especially if you have questions about that going forward. So this next slide is a very general slide. Question is, what are the subjects that U.S. married couples with kindergarten-age children argue about in order of frequency? Now, this is a little hard to see, so I'm going to try and walk through this. The biggest issue is chores and responsibilities. Who's going to wash the dishes? Who's paying the bills? Who's going to the post office, right? Next is money, then children, in terms of how to raise them, et cetera, et cetera. Sexual issues, spending leisure time together, in-laws, showing affection, et cetera, et cetera. I can assure you, having done workshops for all kinds of cultures, I've done this for rich and poor people, people who have been incarcerated, people who are first generation, who have been here for hundreds of years. I can assure you that the issues here on the bottom are always the same. Now, do they track exactly the same way across cultures? Not necessarily. The order of importance may be different. I've seen the issues with regards to in-laws be higher, maybe be number 1 or 2. I've seen issues of money kind of be pushed maybe down to the top 5, but not the top 2. I can assure you all that the issues of our community are not unique. The issues of my community as a Mexican are not unique. The issues may be slightly different order, but the issues are always the same. But let's get into this a little bit more. Like, what does this mean? What does this look like? What are these issues telling us? So let's go back to the generational conflict, right? So these are the things that people fight about, which means that they feel like they're not getting it in the relationships they want. So this will be our first story time for our session. Many years ago, when I was about maybe 2 years into my marriage and relationship work, I was working with a young woman who was a colleague, but not a coworker of mine. And she was of South Asian descent. And she was getting ready to start the marriage process. And so she was talking to her mother, and her grandmother, who was visiting from the old country, happened to be there with her. And so this young woman, who was probably in her 20s at the time, and she was speaking to her mother, and she was like, I can't find a good guy. Like she was really frustrated. She couldn't find someone. And her mother's like, well, what is it that you're looking for? What are you not finding? And the young woman said, like, well, I'm looking for someone who has a good personality. And her grandmother, her ears perked up. She's like, what? And then she asked her daughter to clarify this. She translated personality. And the grandma was like, personality? Who cares about personality for their husband? And she got really fired up. And she's like, personality? Like, what you need to know as a husband, this is completely true. She related this story to me. What you need to know as for your husband is this. Is he going to be a good provider? Number 2, is he going to beat you? Is he not going to beat you that often? Those are the only things you need to be concerned about. And her grandmother was completely serious. Okay, I'm not making a judgment call here, but Perhaps some of you who are first or second generation have heard similar things from your parents or your grandparents. These generational conflicts, right? They come from our parents and our grandparents having a very rigidly defined idea of what a good husband, what a good wife was. And that really is a blessing and a curse. Because I know in my own family, the idea was if a husband provided financially for his family, job done, I'm an awesome husband. my work is done. And so I am very much descended from a line of men who would come, they would work very hard outside the home, but they would come home and the expectation was there would be dinner on the table, the kids would be quiet, and they wouldn't have to deal with anything that they didn't want to because their work was done for the day. So the flip side to that is what? The mother would be working all day, taking care of the kids, all day, cleaning the house, all day preparing the meal, and then she had to take care of her husband when he came home. And she didn't want, the expectation was she was not supposed to bother him, right? Cultural norms, gender expectations. So let's get into this a little bit more. Why was this grandmother so offended by the idea that her granddaughter wanted a man with personality? Now, I will say that in many ways, especially for our first and second generation listeners here, that we have been infected in some ways by like the hyper, capitalist way that love, romantic love, is commodified here in the United States. And frankly, we do put so much more pressure on our romantic partners, our spouses, than our parents or grandparents certainly ever had to experience. The idea that our modern partner must be our partner, must be a provider, a lover, a friend, and an entertainer in some form or fashion, is not something that our parents or grandparents experienced. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that is the reality. That is why if the grandmother was like, personality, who cares about that? And like, she went in her harangue to her granddaughter. She was like, I didn't marry your grandfather because he had a good personality. I knew that he had a good job and he could take care of me financially. The fact that he didn't beat me very often and he was pretty funny was a bonus. Again, I'm translating, but that's like essentially what she said. For her, the metric was, is your potential husband going to be a good provider? Period. That is the defining characteristic of a good or bad husband. That is a very narrow definition, and there is a lot more nuance now. And I think this is where a lot of our generational conflict comes from. This is why you see things like this image right here. This is from a book, which is called How to Be a Modern Husband. Look at this guy. He's happy. He's taking a selfie. Perhaps this is a cross-cultural relationship. Can't quite tell through the image quality. But that bleeds over into other things now. My mother is fond of telling me that my father has changed more diapers in the short time he's been a grandfather than the entire time myself and my two siblings were babies. That was just not something that he had any interest in doing. But he changed the diapers of my sons, right? Think of the parenting issues that we have, the discipline issues that we have. They come from our culture. They come from our expectations of what we should be doing, in our home, and that's changed. Perhaps many of you, grew up with corporal punishment of some form or fashion, got whacked on your butts or your hands or other places if you stepped on a line. That was something that we grew up with. That is something that is changing, is not as accepted as before. The idea that your parents would co-parent, or if that was even a thing, I'm trying to address all these points because so much of our generational conflict comes because the change in our own societies have happened so fast. I use the example of my father again. So many folks who came here to the United States as immigrants, they came and then they were farmers for maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. And then maybe they moved to the big city and they were, working class. They were blue collar. They were working in the factory for maybe 2 or 3 generations. And now the modern generation is white collar. That's not the case for so many Black and brown people who are immigrants. My dad grew up, as I said, in a stone house with a thatched roof with no running water or electricity. He came here, became a blue-collar hero. Myself and my siblings are all white-collar knowledge workers, right? I sit down in my butt all day working on a computer. That happened in one generation. Think of the societal changes that came from that, right? My mom tells me all the time, yes, my dad and her are from the same people, are some from the same area. My dad grew up in the village. My mom did not. There was a cultural difference there that they experienced in terms of how they parented, how they saw the world, which I kind of addressed in some of our earlier sessions. These things set the template for our life, and they address in our minds what is acceptable and not. What are the appropriate gender norms? What are the appropriate parenting norms? This is where our generational conflict comes from. So let's take this a bit further. And again, we always think that our culture is the right one. I apologize for the image quality on this one. This is a little hard to see, right? Talking about it from the gendered perspective, right? We stereotypically think that males are aggressive, they're independent, they're not easily influenced. Traditional feminine stereotypes are, just to name a few, they're very sensitive, that they're prone to crying or whatnot. I remember speaking to a Islamic mentor of mine, and this was early in my journey in Islam, and it was somehow in the context of, I think there had been a death in my family or something like that. I can't remember what it was. Like there was a death somewhere, and the man who I was speaking to, who was an older Arab man, and he was kind of explaining how, like, well, like, as you know, again, it's, those kind of things where, like, obviously, or like when someone starts out with a statement like obviously, or as you know, or people are always like, it's always going to be a very general statement. But he was making a statement, well, like, obviously women can't come to funerals because they just start wailing, and they get very emotional, and that's inappropriate. And I was confused by that because, as I think I've mentioned before, I come from like tough mountain stock in terms of Mexicans, and excessive displays of emotion are very much discouraged in my culture. And so when my Mexican family met my Arab family, like we found them to be very, very expressive, very emotional, very free with their emotions. It was kind of like jarring to us. So in that realm, the idea that someone would be like, very loud and wailing, like at a funeral, was not part of our cultural makeup at all. Again, I'm not making a judgment call. I'm just expressing that when someone came from their own cultural perspective and presented it as fact, which was, he essentially was saying like, well, Stephen, all women, they get really emotional, which is why they can't come to funerals. That was not my cultural expectation. That was not the cultural norm I grew up with, because in my culture, no one should display any emotions ever. And so the idea that you would shame or embarrass yourself by like wailing or or expressing any kind of emotion was just kind of like, that was just very foreign to me. Like, this is not what we did. Why do I use this as an example? We often think that our culture is correct. Obviously the way we do things is 100% right 100% of the time. That's just not very true. And so this is another gendered and generational conflict where we assume that all women are like this, all men are like this, right? I come from a very stoic, like, show no emotion kind of people. And so I am always interested, it's always interesting to me that like how passionate some people are, how emotional some people are. That's just not my personal and cultural background. And it's caused issues for me, right? This is one of those things we really need to think about, is that we think of these things as unique to ourselves, but they're not really. They're coming from our place of our cultural background. So let me use this for another story. As I mentioned before, I do a lot of workshops. I'm always blessed to meet the young people, first or second generation folks, often in their early 20s and undergrad, or perhaps transitioning to postgrad work. Every single time I do a workshop for young adults, because I'm not quite a young adult anymore, I get asked a variation of a question, which starts with, Brother Stephen, is it haram to... And the question might be, is it haram to delay marriage up until I graduate? Is it haram for me to wait until I have my PhD? Is it haram for me to graduate with that and then want to get married? I really want to repeat that and really have you think about what this young person is asking me. is it haram for me to delay marriage until I have my PhD? Now, obviously, they're coming from the the idea, not the idea, the injunction in our faith that marriage is half of our deen, right? We have all heard that. But I think a lot of folks take that very literally in the sense of like, well, I'm like only half a Muslim, or I'm like 50% bad because I'm not married yet. But also the idea that like, well, I want to get married, but not until after I have my PhD. Is that haram? And so my jokey response to that is like, well, I don't think there were PhDs during the time of the Sahaba, so I'm sure you will be okay. But like, I'm joking, but there's a real pain there. But what is it? Look at these young people, right? How much college debt do these people have? These are one of our modern society things, right? The generational issue is for many of our parents, and certainly for our grandparents, they could get good paying jobs with maybe a high school education, or maybe not even that. How many young people do you know, perhaps you're one yourself, that you're graduating, especially during this time of Zoom university, you're struggling to get done with school, you're perhaps facing a mountain of debt and limited or maybe even no job prospects. Our society tells us you have to go to school. Our families tell us you have to go to school. You have to become a doctor, a lawyer, a scientist, what have you. You may incur an enormous amount of student debt, right? Because why? Because you need to have a certain income, so you're an appropriate marriage partner. But in order to do that, you take on a lot of debt, and then you can't fulfill the traditional things that the cultural expectations puts on you, right? I have spoken to so many young brothers, young Muslim men, who are rattled with guilt because they have student debt, because they're terrified that they're going to have to take on like family debt because I have to have a house. I have like it would shame my family or shame my future in-laws if I didn't have a house to move into, or if I didn't have a new car, right? So there's these modern society pressures, and there's these cultural pressures, family pressures that are making people think that they have to check off all these boxes, that they have to have X thousands of dollars of disposable income to buy X thousands of dollars worth of jewelry on top of the dowry, on top of other things. Again, I'm not making a judgment call on people's unique cultural perspectives. Some people do that, some people don't. But I am telling you the reality is that puts an enormous amount of pressure on people, young people who feel like, well, I need to have like $20,000, in liquid cash on top of my savings, so I can, put a down payment on a house, so I can, pay for the wedding, so I can get some good jewelry. And maybe even 20 is not enough. It's 30 or 40 sometimes. These pressures are making people feel like they have to delay marriage so they can save up this money. But then when they do that, they feel that it's haram because marriage is half of our deen, right? And so this is this push-pull of modern life, capitalist impulses to make more money, to be the most highly educated person you can be so you can get the most attractive marriage partner, really is causing people a lot of stress. And I would be very curious in the comments or the questions if this is something that you've seen, if you've known of people who have delayed marriage or really are stressed out about like the debt load that they have and the family obligations they have in order to prepare themselves for marriage, and then that's something that's really stressing them out. So then let's take this a little bit further now. Gender roles in the modern economy. How many of you grew up in a home where there was a single family earner? Probably your dad. I'm assuming very few of you saw what we call a house husband. So a man who is the primary caretaker and like take care of the home, while the wife is the primary bread earner, or maybe even the sole bread earner. That is something that's, I think, perhaps very modern in the United States. Perhaps is something that we didn't grow up with. But again, if we're talking about standard of living, right? And like we got to keep up with the Joneses or the or the Bazis or whoever it may be, because we need to have the best house, we need to have a new car, et cetera, et cetera. If we want to have a certain standard of living in the United States, which is where we're living right now, it's very difficult to do that on a single income. Or if you do want to have it on single income, that single income earner is probably working an enormous amount of hours. It probably has a side hustle, maybe has a rental property. So then you get into issues like work-life balance. And again, what was the benchmark for being a good husband 20, 30, 40 years ago? He's a good provider. He's a good provider. He's taking care of you financially. But now in our modern times, husbands need to be funny. They need to be fun. They need to be good friends. They need to be good partners. But also, they got to be bringing home the money too. That's a lot of pressure that young men feel. Conversely, women now, right? They're are a larger and larger part of the global workforce. They're in new roles and realms. And what's something that I find sadly comical is that, when I do these seminars for young folks, I always get pulled aside by at least one brother, sometimes it's more, and they'll say something along the lines, Brother Steven, this is all great, but you know what the real problem is with women these days? They're not traditional like our mothers and our grandmothers were. They complain too much. They want too much, etc., etc. And they can't even cook like our mothers and our grandmothers could. My comeback to that always is, that's very interesting. I'm just curious, like, are you able to break a horse or build a house? Can you shoot a gun like your fathers and your grandfathers could? That usually shuts them up. My father, as I've said perhaps ad nauseum, he grew up in the mountains. He knew how to cut stone with his bare hands. He could cut down a tree and turn it into a piece of furniture. He knew how to ride a horse. He knew how to shoot a gun. All by the time he was 18. He had all the skills. He had all the boxes checked to make him an eligible marriage partner, to make him an eligible man. Think about that. He was 18. How many 18-year-olds do you know now, or think of yourself when you were 18? Did you feel like, well, I have all the skills I need, to be a fully functioning adult? Time for me to get married. That is something in the United States, across all cultures, across all communities, that really is changing. That there's this idea of like delayed adolescence, because many people don't feel like fully functioning adults till they're in their mid to late 20s. They don't have the skills. They don't have the financial bagging. They don't feel they have the educational level. They certainly don't feel they have the career attainment that they feel is necessary for them to be a good marriage partner. I'm not saying that they're right. I'm just telling you that's how people feel. This is the modern problems that many people are experiencing, that they feel like they have to achieve a certain level of income or success before they can even begin to look for a marriage partner. And that is a big problem that I see going forward. And again, so you have this thing too, where you have women are taking on a larger role outside the house in the economy. But that what problems does that cause, right? So I will address this with another story. And again, this was one that was told to me, and I always think of this when I do this kind of lesson. And so I was working with a group of people, and I happened to be working with a grandmother and a grandmother and a granddaughter. It was like a family business, right? And the granddaughter came in. She was late to work. She was very upset. Like, I think she had broken up with her fiance or boyfriend or something like that. And she threw down her bag. She turned to her grandmother, and she just kind of announced to the whole team, "I'm never getting married." And her grandmother, who was this sweet, sweet, sweet old traditional lady, like literally looked like the old grandma who would bake you cookies, and give you a glass of milk, with complete sincerity. She was aghast. She was horrified when she heard that her granddaughter's declaration that I'm never getting married. And you know what she said? She said, with complete sincerity, "But who will you cook for?" Now, let's unpack that. She was not being disrespectful. She was not being insulting. In her mind, her grandmother's mind, and they were coworkers, right? In her grandmother's mind, she could not envision a life for her granddaughter, or herself for that matter, which did not involve service as a spouse to a man, to a husband. So when she said, "But who will you cook for?" what was she really saying? She's saying, like, but you will have no function. Like, how will you exist without the purpose with which you were created for? She was so worried for her. And of course, her granddad got over it. She eventually got married and whatnot. But think about what she's saying. Think about the import behind her words. But who will you cook for? Right? Take that in the reverse. For so many men who will say, like, what's the point of working so hard if I can't get married, if I don't have a spouse, if I'm not building towards something, what's the point, right? Where all these come from our cultural expectation, our gender expectations. Again, I'm not making a judgment call on them. I'm just telling you this is where they come from. And so when we have the desire to, as a woman, to me, work outside the home and perhaps not be, very homey, or as a man, perhaps you want to cook and take care of the home. These modern conflicts that we're having of people saying, like, well, he's not masculine enough, or she's too masculine. It comes from our cultural experiences and our cultural norms, which tell us that a woman's role is to be a partner in the service of her spouse. A husband's role exists to provide financially for his family, and everything else is a bonus. That is clearly not what the vast majority of people want for themselves. And that right there is the rub. That's where the conflict is coming from. And we need to sort through these things. Because when young people try to talk to their parents or their grandparents about, finding a partner with a good personality or wanting something different for themselves, it's very confusing and even perhaps frightening to their parents and grandparents because they don't understand why they would want something. Why you want to change up the script for something that has been happening for so long? That's where I think a lot of this conflict comes from. So as we wind down and we start to have these difficult conversations, we always want to try to be assertive, not passive or aggressive with our behavior, right? This is a little bit of review here. We need to watch our body language. We need to try not to be passive in our communication. So we can think of our grandmother in my story who was very assertive. She was like, why would you want someone who has a good personality? Who cares about that? She was being very clear about what she wanted, right? And her granddaughter had to try to explain that she wanted more out of a partner. And there was a language barrier there. She wanted more for herself. I'm not making a judgment call on any of these things. But the idea of wanting more from a partner is a very real desire and a very valid desire. But I feel it's increasingly hard for both male and female partners to deliver on that. People are stressed out over how much work that they have. Perhaps they feel unsatisfied in their work. That's something else we need to even get into. I think I might have alluded to this before, but I always think of my father and my grandfather. They would work hard all day in the fields or in the factory. At least they got a good workout. Like they felt they could see the fruits of their labor. My grandfather could see how many bushels of corn he harvested. My dad knew how many parts he had made or how many machines he had fixed. At the end of my day, I shot a bunch of emails. I did a bunch of spreadsheets. My butt is sore from sitting down all day. They were sore because they worked hard physically. They used their bodies all day, right? Think of how different our lives are from our parents and our grandparents. The idea that we would want more seems perhaps selfish to us or maybe confusing to them. So as we communicate what we want, I always encourage people to use these best practices, to use open-ended questions. So if you try to talk to your elders about what they want in a spouse, first of all, you should perhaps get prepared for some very funny answers. But again, always use careful, non-judgmental statements. As we've said before, generally men prefer direct problem-solving talk. Women may prefer a focus on the process rather than the endpoint. Always incorporate your active listening skills, which, as we talked about before, when you're talking to parents or about what you want, try to use things like the floor. Really try to be clear, but use your XYZ statements. When one of my coworkers said, well, I want someone who has a good personality, what's she really trying to say? I want someone who's going to be entertaining, who will stimulate my mind, who will be someone I want to talk to, who will be my friend. And this is important to me because I was an only child and I felt lonely because my parents worked outside the home all the time. Not an easy thing to say, not an easy thing to hear, right? Let me say that again. After the kind of conversation with her grandmother, that when they were speaking one-on-one, not in front of her mother because she was afraid it would hurt her mother, she said what I just said. It's important to me to find a husband who has a good personality because I don't want to be lonely like I was when I was a child. I was alone a lot. My parents worked all the time. They were in school. My dad was working in his business. My mom was busy with my siblings because she had a lot of siblings. And so she felt lonely in the sense of she didn't have someone to really connect with. Connection. That's something that I think so many people are missing. And again, perhaps our parents or grandparents would have known that, or they maybe they didn't feel that lax. They were always together. Definitely a question to ask. But always use your XYZ statements because it will help you dig deeper in these difficult conversations. If you're perhaps thinking about a cross-cultural relationship, you have to be prepared to explain why this person is better than all the other Syrians, all the other Mexicans, all the other Yemenis that could possibly exist. Because in your parents' minds, it will be like, oh, I guess our culture is not good enough for you, right? That may be how they take it. So you may need to explain, well, that's not true. I'm sorry you feel the way. This is how I feel. Again, use those non-gentle, active listening skills. Be careful with your words. Be careful with your body language. These things are not easy, right? So as before, I want to try and wrap this up with time to spare for questions. As always, I cover a wide range of topics here. I hope that you found this to be helpful. I can assure you all the stories that I told you were true. And if you have additional questions, I would love to hear them. I see we have a comment. It's written in Arabic, unfortunately, which, again, cultural barrier here. I cannot read that in Arabic. So if someone could translate that for me, I would be grateful. If there are other questions, feel free to ask them now. But I just want to stress so much that when parents or grandparents are resistant to perhaps cross-cultural relationships or things of that nature, and I experienced that myself, as I get older now, I understand the hesitation. I understand the fear or even the pushback. I get that more now than I would have as a young man, right? I think about those wise words from the Imam. Think of everything that they had to give up, your parents and your grandparents, the changes that they had to experience. They were probably okay with doing that. That was a sacrifice they were willing to make. But as they see their children or their grandchildren possibly stepping further away from the culture, that frightens them. It makes them afraid. It makes them maybe feel guilty about what they did or did not do in terms of how they raised you, how they conducted their lives. And so they're going to perhaps react very strongly. If you want a partner that's very different than your parents raised you, you have to articulate that in your own mind. Well, why is that? What is it that you want? Why do you want those things? Use those XYZ statements, use those active listening skills. It will make these difficult conversations much easier. So again, as always, thank you so much for attending this session. Inshallah, it was helpful. I hope this opened up some interesting thoughts for you. If you guys want to open that door, I would encourage you to talk to your parents. You would be surprised how many of your parents or grandparents had perhaps other marriages or other marriage offers, and many of them will be like, oh, Amar or Bilal want to marry me, but I chose your grandfather because of XYZ, whatever it is. And those are always very interesting to learn from, to understand what they wanted in their lives, what they want from you. Ask them, what are the things that they are concerned about in the future? And that will open up so many questions. And again, I can't stress this enough. That so much of the pressure we feel for ourselves comes from this ever-increasing desire of, gotta have that new house, gotta have that new car, gotta have that new TV. And so that's making people feel like they have to check off all these boxes before they can get married, which we know Islamically is not the way, is not our example. You know, the Rasul was much younger than Khadijah. And so again, like we hear things sometimes that, you know, like it's haram for a Muslim man to marry a woman who's older than him. Hello, like are you not familiar with the Sirah? But these are the things that we hear a lot. We have cultural things, cultural traditions that get in the way, I think, often of our opportunities for happiness. So to recap, as we're winding down, I think so many of us are experiencing a lot of pressure from modern life, feeling pressure from our parents or grandparents who generally, for the most part, really want the best for us, and they're concerned about us. The best way to diffuse that is through some good communication skills. I hope, as always, this was helpful, inshallah. Thank you so much for someone who offered the peace and blessing for everyone here and for myself. I genuinely appreciate that. I hope this conversation has been helpful. If there are other questions, I would love to take them now. And inshallah, you'll be here for our last session, which tentatively we're going to discuss birth order questions and how that affects us as children and adults as well. And if you guys do want me to do birth order, I'm happy to do that. Let me know specifically like what you would like to do about that. We could perhaps, I'm thinking perhaps we might do birth order and personality types. So that's always fun because I think we all think is, you know, well, we're unique individuals, but we're all kind of basically the same, but we're not because we react so differently to different things. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. I'm thinking maybe birth order and personality type. There is a great like activity, very simple that we might be able to do over the session, like even the video session. So inshallah, I'll see if I can maybe do that. It's like to take us back to our place holding thing. Good question to ask your parents and grandparents. Ask them open-ended questions. What are the qualities of a good husband? What are the qualities of a good wife? See what they say. I'm very curious. Again, these issues are not unique to us. Same everywhere else. Believe me, they're always the same. The order is a little bit different. The issues are always the same. Again, for those of you who maybe came in a little bit late, my name is Stephen Hernandez. Inshallah, this topic was of help to you all. Thank you for those of you who stuck through, and I hope you enjoyed it. Marriage and relationship educator. If you would like to see some more of the sessions I've done kind of on my own, you can go to my YouTube channel, which is Stephen Hernandez's Nonprofit Fundamentals, or my podcast, which is similarly named Stephen Hernandez's Nonprofit and Relationship Fundamentals. So we are just about out of time for our day today. Inshallah, this was helpful to you all. And I will see you next week, inshallah. Take care.